The sword that was used only to grant forgiveness. It was a sword, but not like the others. It didn't hang above a throne or shine on the battlefield. It didn't carry blood or glory. It sat in silence, resting on stone, deep in the cloisters of a wind-lashed monastery in the north. Cold iron, wrapped in worn leather, passed not through war, but through hands that trembled with something far more dangerous than vengeance. This sword was used only to forgive. The monastery, remote and stone-built, stood at the edge of civilization, part prison, part sanctuary. In the early medieval period, long before kings built towering prisons, those guilty of grave sins were sometimes sent not to cells, but to the silence of God, to monastic exile, a life of prayer, penance, and isolation, a life lived among chants and shadows, and in one such place, the monks created a ritual unlike any other. When a new prisoner arrived, whether a murderer, a thief, or a nobleman fallen from grace, he was brought to a room where the sword lay waiting. A monk would lift it, not to condemn him, but to pass it to him. The sword had belonged, they said, to a warrior who had turned his blade away from blood after taking one life too many. He came to the monastery, laid down the weapon, and begged to be allowed to stay. The monks gave him silence, and he gave them a vow that the sword would never be used for violence again. Instead, it would pass from hand to hand among those condemned not to death, but to memory. Each man, upon receiving it, was told only this: forgive the one who came before you, whatever he did, whatever you think. Forgive him, as you will need to be forgiven. And then he would place the sword on the table for the next. No one was forced. There were no consequences for refusal. But something strange happened. Over the years, no one used it to harm. No one broke the vow. Some held it with anger. Some wept. Some whispered names. Some stared into the blade and said nothing at all. But every man in time forgave. There are surviving monastery records, brief, fragile accounts written in fading Latin. One entry reads, Brother Alric held the blade for 3 days, then returned it, eyes red, lips sealed. Another simply says, Ethelwulf wept and would not speak, but passed it on. It became known as the Blade of Mercy, not as a relic, not as a magical object, but as a mirror, a ritual, a burden shared between the broken. They came in chains. They left in silence. And the sword remained, not as a symbol of judgment, but of impossible grace. Historians debate how many men passed it between them, whether the story of the warrior who left it behind was true or legend layered over time. But the sword itself, rough, unadorned, honest, has been found. Discovered centuries later in the ruins of that northern monastery, buried under rubble, wrapped in rotted cloth, still intact. The monks had fled or died during war. The ritual ended, but the sword stayed. It never left. And when examined, it bore no edge. The blade had been deliberately dulled. It could no longer cut. It was never meant to. It had become something else entirely. Not a weapon, but a question. What do you do with pain that cannot be undone? What do you do with guilt that cannot be lifted? What do you do with a past that follows you into stone walls and cold beds? You pass it on. You offer a choice. You hold the sword. Not to strike, but to forgive the man who held it before you, a stranger, a sinner, a mirror. And you hope, when your time comes, that someone will do the same for you. Today, the Blade of Mercy rests in a museum behind glass. People walk past it, not knowing what it is. Just another rusted piece of iron, dulled and silent. But once, long ago, in a place where men had nothing left but silence, it was everything. It was proof that even in darkness, someone had chosen not to take, but to let go. So the next time you hear of swords and the stories they carry, remember this one. Not forged for battle, not raised in war, but passed in quiet hands, from the broken to the condemned, offering not justice, but something harder, forgiveness. The blade that was sharpened, but never cut. In a remote fortress of stone and silence, buried in the highlands of France, a mystery endured for centuries. Every cell, no matter how damp, how cold, how forgotten, held a sword. Not rusted, not ceremonial, real, sharp, oiled, resting in its scabbard, perfectly kept, never used. For 300 years, prisoners were locked into solitude, with a weapon by their side, and not one of them ever drew it. This is not folklore. It's recorded in the garrison logs of Château Montvieux, a fortress prison built in the 15th century and active well into the 1700s. Deep within its isolated stone wings, high above any road or escape path, the cells were plain. Stone bench, water basin, straw bedding, and the blade. Mounted not on the wall, not displayed, but placed gently beside the prisoner on their first day. Sometimes bound with a ribbon, sometimes lying bare on the stone, but always sharp, and always sealed. No guard would answer questions. No official records explain why it was there. Only a single phrase scratched into a wood beam in the overseer's quarters. It is not the sword that binds them, but the oath that silences it. What was this oath? Why leave a weapon in reach of the accused? Some historians argue it was symbolic, a ritual of choice, that each prisoner, on arrival, was told the same line. This blade has been sharpened for you, but you must never use it. Swear it, and you will keep your name. Draw it, and you lose yourself forever. A test of restraint, of madness, of identity. Those who refused the oath were placed in other cells, those without blades. Records show those men died faster, starved, broke, or vanished. But the ones who accepted the oath, they stayed longer, some for years, some for life. And still the blades remained untouched. Not a single report exists of a prisoner turning the sword on a guard. Not one attempted to escape using it. Not one body was ever found, with the blade drawn beside it. But what they did do was sharpen it. Cell records note whetstones given out monthly. Guards were instructed to replace them, but never to take the sword. Some even claimed prisoners would meditate with the blade, cleaning it daily, whispering to it, treating it as something sacred. One guard's letter, preserved in a monastery archive, describes the eerie calm. They do not speak. They do not rage. But each morning, the steel shines. It is as though the sword carries their sorrow for them. The blade then was not a weapon, it was a mirror. For some, perhaps, it was a reminder of what they had once been, soldiers, farmers, fathers. For others, it was temptation restrained, the knowledge that violence lay always within reach. And still, they refused. There's one theory that haunts scholars most, that the sword was meant not as mercy, but as truth. That the prison, designed for those who had committed acts of betrayal or cowardice, offered each man a choice: end it or endure. That every day the prisoner saw the blade was another day he chose to live, not out of fear, but of defiance. And in doing so, the sword remained silent. When Château Montvieux was abandoned in the late 18th century during the chaos of revolution, officials discovered something chilling. In 47 of the final 51 occupied cells, the sword was still there, wrapped, clean, sheathed, in some cases sharpened to a razor's edge. Not one was stained, not one was broken. Only one sword was found drawn, laid across the lap of a man who had died in meditation. He left no note, only a final engraving on the scabbard. Forgive what I once was. Today, the fortress is ruin. Tourists come for the view. Few notice the scabbard fragments buried in dust. Fewer still know that a blade ever waited in the cells. But in quiet circles of historians, the tale endures. The blade that was sharpened, but never cut. The sword that waited, not for blood, but for peace. And the oath that outlasted iron. The sword that cried during storms. It was never drawn, never used, never sharpened. But every man in the dungeon feared it more than death itself. They called it the Weeping Blade. It lay hidden in a crumbling corner of a Bohemian prison, passed down not as a weapon, but as a warning. The dungeon itself was carved into the bedrock beneath an old hill fort, where political prisoners, heretics, and the forgotten were thrown in to vanish. There were no windows, no trial, just the sound of dripping water, coughing souls, and time grinding slowly through the dark. And in the lowest cell, chained to the wall, sat a sword. No one remembered who brought it there. Some said it was left by a mad knight. Others whispered it was found buried beneath the prison itself, uncovered during construction and sealed back inside when men started disappearing. What made it feared wasn't its edge. It wasn't drawn, ever. What made it feared was what it did during storms. Whenever lightning cracked the sky above the prison and thunder rolled down the stones, the sword would begin to weep. Condensation formed along its blade, slow, thick drops of water sliding down the steel like tears. The air would grow damp, but not from the rain above. The cell would chill, and those nearby swore they could hear it, a faint metallic ringing, like a sigh or a sob. And then the deaths began. Not murder, not violence, just sudden silence. A prisoner who stared too long, another who tried to touch the hilt. One man, delirious from fever, tried to draw it. He was found dead the next morning, eyes wide, body untouched, chains still locked. After that, no one dared speak its name aloud. The guards refused to move it. The priests who came to bless the dungeon left without finishing the rites. And the prisoners, they passed it down like a ghost story, whispering warnings to the new arrivals. The rule was simple: never speak to it, never reach for it, never face it when the lightning comes, and always turn your back when it cries. Some believed the sword absorbed sorrow, that it had witnessed so many deaths, betrayals, and forgotten lives that it became a vessel for despair itself. Others thought it was cursed from the beginning, wrought from iron stolen from a church bell, quenched in the blood of a child. But no one could say for sure, because no one knew. The sword was never drawn. Decades passed, then centuries. The prison was eventually abandoned, left to moss and echo. Scholars rediscovered it in the 19th century, and among the collapsed cells and rusted manacles, they found the sword, still in its place, still chained to the wall, still untouched. They took it, cleaned it, displayed it in a regional museum under glass, labeled simply, "Unusual Prison Artifact, circa 1400s. But when storms roll in, it weeps there too. Visitors have reported fog forming inside the case, alarms triggered by drops of moisture. Security footage occasionally shows nothing, or too much. Blurred shapes, flickers of movement, a smear of water running down the blade, from no source at all. And still, no one has drawn it, not out of law, but out of fear. Because the sword was never a tool. It was a memory of pain, of loss, of voices forgotten in the stone, and perhaps it simply weeps so the world never forgets them. The executioner's blade, that no one could lift in battle, it was never meant for war. The blade was black, not from paint or rust, but from something older. Oil, ash, blood. They called it Morkstahl in the old tongue, dark steel, and though it was forged like any other sword, quenched in fire and sharpened to a perfect edge, this blade was not raised in glory. It was raised in judgment. For generations, it belonged to the executioner. Passed from father to son, master to apprentice, it never left the town square. It was not worn on a belt or carried into taverns. It stayed locked beneath the gallows, waiting. It was a sword that killed only those who knelt. Its grip was wrapped in worn leather. Its edge was flawless. But something about it felt wrong. Too cold. Too heavy. The weight wasn't metal. It was memory. Every life it took stayed with it, or so the story went. The first executioner said it was light, balanced, perfect. By the time his son wielded it, the sword had changed. Not in shape, not in size, but in weight. The son said it resisted movement, that when he raised it above a condemned man's neck, the blade trembled in his hands, not from fear, but from something else, a presence, a burden. Still, it did its work. Dozens fell to it, then hundreds. Thieves, rebels, murderers, some guilty, some not. And with each life taken, the sword grew heavier. Eventually a war came. The town was under siege. Every man was called to defend it. The executioner, loyal and grim, offered to fight. He brought the black blade to the battlements, his family's heirloom, his only weapon. But on the field, it would not rise. He could barely lift it. The sword that had moved like breath in the square was now stiff, unresponsive. It dragged in the dirt, anchoring him like stone. Other soldiers tried to help. Young men, strong and unafraid, but none could wield it. None could even swing it properly. The blade had become something else, not a weapon, a relic. They carried it back in silence. From that day forward, the sword was never used in battle. It returned to its post, beside the gallows where its weight made sense, where its silence was understood. Scholars say it was psychological, that the heaviness was in the mind, not the metal. That guilt passed through generations, built into the bones of those who held it. But the old executioners knew better. They believed the sword remembered, that it had counted every life, and with each soul taken, it absorbed the gravity of choice. They said that by the time you killed your 10th man, the sword had begun to judge you. Even after executions ended, the blade was kept, polished, preserved, not as a weapon, but as a warning. It hung in the town hall for decades, then centuries, still black, still too heavy. Visitors tried to lift it, tourists, soldiers, athletes. Most failed. A few could raise it, but none could swing it cleanly. And those who tried said the same thing. It felt like someone was holding it back. Whether cursed or not, the sword remained. Not as a symbol of justice, but of consequence. Because in time, the villagers understood. It was never about the blade. It was about what the blade had done. They stopped speaking its name, stopped calling it a sword at all. To them it was a weight, a sentence, a reminder that power taken, even by law, never comes without cost. It is said that the last executioner, dying without sons, buried the blade beneath the place where the scaffold once stood, that he left no marker, that he whispered to the ground, "Let no one lift it again." But some say it was unearthed, that it rests in a museum now, behind glass, mislabeled as a ceremonial weapon, that people still try to lift it. And when they do, for a moment, they feel something cold, heavy, watching, because the sword, even in silence, still carries what no one else could, the weight of the final breath, the sound of the last heartbeat, the moment between mercy and command. Not all weapons rust, some remember. The sword with names etched by the doomed. In the stone-cold shadows of a German prison, somewhere between the crumbling centuries of the Middle Ages and the rise of modern law, there lay a sword, heavy, broad, dull not from disuse, but from repetition. It wasn't kept in an armory. It wasn't wielded in battle. It waited in a chamber of silence for the next name to be called. This was not a sword of glory. It was a tool, an instrument of state, a blade used for executions, and on its hilt, worn smooth by trembling hands, prisoners began to leave their mark. They scratched their names into it. Not grand, sweeping inscriptions, just initials, crude etchings, often made with shaking fingers or sharp nails. Some wrote prayers, others scratched curses, and some simply begged not to be next. This sword, discovered in what was once a municipal jail in southern Germany, became known among local historians as the blade that remembered, because unlike most weapons of power, it did not speak of victory. It spoke of fear. Execution swords were different from war swords. They were made wide, flat, and often unsharpened near the tip. Designed to sever with a single clean stroke, they required precision, not in battle, but in judgment. And unlike the gallows or the axe, the sword was seen in some cities as a more honorable death, reserved for those deemed noble or simply fortunate enough to die without spectacle. But there was no honor in this one. It was used in a prison where executions were public but intimate, witnessed by guards, officials, and sometimes priests. Those sentenced to death were allowed, for a few final moments, to hold the blade, to touch the object that would end them. And in that moment, alone, terrified, clinging to something solid, they carved names, dates, pleas, fragments. One line reads, "I was afraid and God did not answer." Another, "Forgive them or don't." Most are just names. Names no one remembers now, but the sword did. Historians believe the practice began not as tradition, but as impulse. The first prisoner to carve likely did so in panic, but others followed. Word spread. Guards began to allow it or ignored it entirely. Over time, the blade's handle became a record, not of executions, but of those who faced them. And that, perhaps, is what makes this object so haunting. It is not a relic of violence, it is a vessel of voices. In a world where the condemned were stripped of title, property, and name, the sword gave them one last space to be heard. No judge could erase the etchings. No priest could silence them with rites. No executioner could swing the blade hard enough to remove the words already left behind. It became a paradox, an instrument of silence that spoke. Today the sword is preserved in a museum, its markings faint but visible under the right light. Forensic analysis has revealed dozens of layers, Names etched over names, messages fading into each other. Some are scratched so deep the metal buckled. Others are barely there, ghostwriting from the edge of death. No two inscriptions are alike. Some were calm, others frantic. Some seemed resigned. But all of them are real. Real people. Real endings. And what they chose to leave behind wasn't beauty, or wisdom, or even final words. It was a single desperate act of self-preservation. If I must die, let me at least leave a mark. It is easy to speak of justice in the abstract, easier still to admire weapons behind glass, but this sword resists that comfort. It does not glorify the executioner. It does not weep for the condemned. It simply records, and in that recording, it reminds us that every system of order has its ghosts, not in stories, but in steel. So the next time you see a blade on display, bright, polished, triumphant, ask yourself, who held it last? Not the victor, not the knight, but the doomed. And did they too try to write something down before the light left them? Because sometimes, the most human thing we can do in the face of silence is scratch our name into it. The royal sword of mercy that was given to the condemned, it had no edge, no point, no power to cut nor defend. And yet, it was the last sword many people ever saw. They called it the sword of mercy. But to those who stood before it, shackled and trembling, it was little more than a lie wrapped in iron. In England's long tradition of royal ceremony, few symbols are as strange or as cruel as this. A blunt ceremonial blade known as kurtana, presented to the condemned as a sign of divine mercy. It was used in coronations, paraded through royal courts, a symbol of justice tempered with compassion. Its broken tip was meant to reflect the idea that the sovereign, in all their might, could choose not to strike. That mercy was as holy as punishment. But in dungeons, in gallows courts, it meant something else entirely. Records from the 14th and 15th centuries describe a chilling ritual. Certain prisoners, especially high-born or symbolic cases, were brought before a priest, a judge, and a masked executioner. And before their sentence was read, a sword with no point was placed in front of them. They were told this: "You stand before the mercy of the crown, not the sword that cuts, but the sword that forgives." The implication? That they might be spared. Some wept. Some knelt. Some reached toward it, thinking it meant life. But most were executed anyway, because the sword wasn't there to save them. It was there to cleanse the conscience of those watching. For the court, it meant compassion had been considered. For the priest, it meant prayer had been offered. For the record books, it meant mercy had been present, even when it was never chosen. The sword became a prop in a theater of death, one that pretended at kindness, even as it led people to the scaffold. Its appearance was pristine, gold accents, polished steel, inscriptions invoking divine right. But its purpose was hollow, its mercy, selective. And for the condemned, it became a cruel symbol of what might have been. Why show it at all? Because power needs ritual, and mercy, when denied, must still be performed. A kingdom that kills must also look like it prays. And so, kurtana, the broken blade, was paraded not only at coronations, but in the darkest corners of royal justice. But some whispered that the sword held more than symbolism, that its presence brought despair, that those who were shown it and still executed died heavier, not because their crimes were worse, but because hope had been offered and then snatched away. One letter from a 16th century prisoner reads, "They gave me the sword that has no end, and yet mine came all the same." Over time, the sword became confined to ceremony. It is still carried in coronations to this day, part of England's crown jewels, symbolizing clemency, purity, peace. But it once sat on the edge of despair, held in flickering candlelight, while souls waited to be erased. And that's the thing about mercy. It cuts deepest when withheld, a sword that never struck, but still scarred. A symbol of grace, used to comfort the powerful, not the dying. And though it bears no edge, to those who saw it last, it was sharper than any blade. The black blade that chose its holder in silence. It was never seen arriving, and yet, before the first rays of morning pierced the stone cracks, there it lay, a black blade resting on the cold floor of the cell, silent, motionless, but always pointing in one direction, toward someone, and if it pointed toward you, everything changed. This is the legend of the blade that chose. In a forgotten Gothic prison buried beneath the cliffs of Eastern Europe, long before the concept of justice was written into law, there was a practice known only as the Night of the Blade. No documents, no records, only oral accounts, passed down by trembling hands and whispered behind locked doors. It began with prisoners awakening to a soundless shift in the dark. They'd rise from straw pallets and find it, black as pitch, matte, flawless, unlike any forged steel they'd ever seen, laid diagonally on the floor. Simple hilt. No markings, no blood, and always pointing at someone. A cell might hold 5 men, or 10, and though none recalled hearing footsteps, none remembered sleep, all remembered waking to find the blade angled toward one body. Never the same person twice, never the same cell 2 nights in a row. No one knew who placed it. No one ever admitted to carrying it. The guards claimed innocence. They swore under oath, even under torture, that they had no knowledge of it. Some believed them. Others didn't. What's chilling is what followed. If the blade pointed toward you, your sentence was changed, reduced, sometimes erased. Some prisoners were released the very next day. Some were reassigned to work outside the walls. Others had their names struck from execution ledgers, their manacles removed without explanation. It didn't matter who they were, or what they had done. It only mattered that the blade had chosen them. Others, those not chosen, waited, feared, deteriorated. There were stories of men who slept each night with eyes wide open, terrified they might miss their moment, and others who begged the blade aloud, night after night, until madness claimed them. Why did it choose some and not others? No pattern was ever found. The chosen weren't always innocent. In fact, many were killers, thieves, deserters. But those spared by the blade rarely returned to crime. They vanished into forests, became monks. Some built shrines to nothing but the memory of a black sword that turned toward them like a whisper from the divine, and those it never chose rotted. One surviving journal, written by a monk who had once served as a prison clerk, describes the black blade as an angel's nail, forged not to cut, but to judge. He writes of prisoners screaming in the morning, not in terror, but in awe. Others fell to their knees when they saw the point aimed at their chest, not knowing if it meant life or death, but knowing they had been seen. The blade never spoke, never moved again. Once found, it remained still until removed by an unknown hand, gone by morning the next day. Some believed it was punishment. Some believed it was mercy. And some, the most haunted, believed the blade wasn't placed at all, that it appeared by itself, that the prison had become sacred or cursed or both, that the walls remembered things and that the blade was the memory made metal. Over the decades, the prison was sealed, flooded by landslides, its records destroyed by fire. But the legend never died. In villages nearby, they still tell stories of a prison that judged without courts, of a blade that saw through flesh and into soul, a blade black as night, drawn not to blood, but to the heart. And they say, if you sleep in the old ruins on a night with no moon, you might still wake to it, waiting, pointed, watching, and in that moment it will not matter who you were, only what you are, the sword that was buried with no one. It had never drawn blood. The sword stood in the courtyard of a Spanish prison, upright, embedded in the soil as if waiting for a hand that never came. It wasn't rusted. It wasn't broken. It wasn't even ceremonial. It was real, steel-forged, edge-honed, a weapon ready for use. But no one ever used it, because this was not a soldier's blade. It was a prison sword, and it was buried with no one. No one knows who placed it there. The oldest records mention it only in passing, as La Espada Silente, the silent sword. No name, no origin, no deed. Just that it stood in the central yard, tipped down in the ground, always in the same spot. Never moved, never touched. It was said to be an executioner's sword that never tasted flesh. Ordered for use, forged for death. But when it arrived, the appointed man refused to wield it. Whether out of fear, faith, or fate, he would not raise it. And so the sword was planted instead of swung, buried, not broken, left standing like a sentinel. But that wasn't the end. Because on nights of execution, when the prisoners were quiet and the air turned cold, the sword began to whisper. The stories came first in hushed tones, shared between men in chained cells and stone-walled dormitories. Some said they heard nothing. Others heard everything. The sword, they claimed, murmured names. Sometimes the name of the man about to die, sometimes the names of others, future names. Names no one had spoken aloud. One inmate reported hearing his own name whispered 3 nights before an unexpected transfer, to the gallows. Another claimed the sword whispered a list, names of those who had betrayed others to the guards. Days later, those men were gone. No one could prove anything. But the stories spread, and the fear grew. Prisoners began avoiding the courtyard at night. Guards refused to patrol near the blade after dusk. Some covered their ears when walking past it. Others left offerings near the hilt, scraps of bread, coins, small crosses, not out of worship, out of superstition, out of dread, because the sword had never killed, but it had seen. It stood there for decades, untouched by war, weather, or use, always sharp, always upright. Generations of inmates passed through the prison, and the stories never stopped. Even priests sent to minister the condemned reported strange dreams of cold steel, whispered warnings, and a voice that came from no throat. One legend says the sword was forged by a man who knew it would never strike, that he made it to carry judgment, not in action, but in presence, that its true power wasn't in death, but in knowing. Historians scoff at the myth. They say it was likely symbolic, a punishment that never needed delivering, a threat cast in iron. But they can't explain the consistency of the reports. The names whispered before events, the chilling silence that fell over the yard. The way, even in bright daylight, no one would lay a hand on the hilt. And then, it vanished. Sometime in the 19th century, during reforms and reconstruction, the courtyard was paved over. The sword, still standing, was quietly removed, or buried. No one wrote down where it went. No record of transfer, no museum entry. It simply disappeared, like a secret sealed in stone. But those who lived there remember. A former guard, long after retirement, confessed that he still heard the whisper in his sleep. Another man, released after a long sentence, returned to the prison's ruins in old age. He stood where the sword had once been and wept. When asked why, he only said, "It said I'd live. It was right." We don't know if the sword truly whispered, or if fear gave it a voice. But we know this. In a place where death was delivered in routine, where names were erased as easily as they were assigned, the blade that never swung became the loudest voice of all. The sword that was buried with no one carried more judgment than the ones that struck. Because some blades do not kill. Some blades remember. And some, if you listen closely enough in the dark, still speak. The forged blade with no purpose but remembrance. It was not a weapon for war, not for duels, not for self-defense. It was a sword, forged from shackles. In a gray stone fortress near the misty flanks of the Alps, there stood a ceremonial blade unlike any other. Its steel was dark, uneven, flecked with old scars. If you looked closely, you could see the faintest impressions of links. Bracelets once closed around desperate wrists. The hilt was wrapped in worn leather, but beneath the binding, jagged pieces of broken iron pressed outward, cool and unyielding. This was a sword made from chains, chains that had once held men deemed traitors, rebels, dissidents, men whose names were lost, but whose defiance had threatened the fortress, the lords, the order of things. The story began with a failed revolt. On a winter's night, a group of prisoners, starved, battered, half-mad with hope, had tried to overthrow their keepers. Their plan failed. Their leaders were executed at dawn, and their chains, battered and bent in struggle, were collected by the warden. But instead of discarding them or melting them for coin, the warden gave a strange order. Make them into a sword, not for killing, for remembering. The smiths went to work, their hammers ringing in cold air. The iron was stubborn, twisted with stories, but finally, it yielded. The blade they drew from those shackles was short, heavy, and crude, but it shone, just barely, in the torchlight. It would never swing in anger. It would never taste blood. Instead, it was passed from prisoner to prisoner, from cell to cell, a relic with no use but memory. Each man who held it knew what it was made of. They could feel the ridges where iron once circled bone. They could imagine the hands that fought, the hands that failed, the hands that died. It became a symbol of two things: justice and loss. The guards feared it, though it was kept blunt. They knew it was not a tool, but a story, one too heavy to silence. When tempers rose, the blade would be brought out and held between two prisoners, not to threaten, but to remind. This is what happens when we forget who we are. This is what happens when we let hope turn to hate. This is what happens when the world is changed by force, not faith. It was a reminder both of what was lost and of what might be reclaimed. Over decades, the fortress changed hands. Rulers fell, new banners flew. The sword remained. In times of peace, it was hidden. In times of unrest, it reappeared, carried from cell to cell in darkness. Some prisoners wept to touch it. Others spat on it, cursing the memory of defeat. A few, those who remembered the revolt, held it to their chests and whispered names. It became a tradition. When a new prisoner arrived, the sword was shown, wordlessly, as a warning and a comfort. You are not the first. You will not be the last. What binds you now may, one day, be turned to memory. Eventually, the fortress fell into ruin, its stones scattered by time, its walls split by frost. The sword was found centuries later, buried in a collapsed cell, the leather rotten, but the iron whole. On the blade, faint letters were scratched, too worn to read. Perhaps names, perhaps curses, perhaps prayers. It now rests behind glass in a small mountain museum. Few visitors come. Fewer still understand what it is. But sometimes, in the cold morning light, the blade seems to shimmer, as if it remembers, as if it mourns. Not all swords are made for war. Some are made to teach, to remind, to keep alive the memory of those whose voices were silenced, but whose shackles became something more. So the next time you see a sword behind glass, look closely, not at the edge, but at the scars. The stories trapped in metal, the reminder that what once was used to bind can be forged into something that endures. A blade with no purpose but remembrance. The sword with a broken tip that matched a broken oath. In a forgotten prison beneath the stones of northern Italy, a sword was once sealed into the wall, snapped clean at the tip, never sharpened again. It was not a weapon of victory. It was a relic of disgrace. Because it was broken by the man who once swore to wield it. The records are sparse, a single name, a sealed confession. A nobleman condemned not for murder, but for betrayal, of a vow, a cause, a brotherhood. Some say he surrendered a city, others say he sold a garrison's position in the night. But whatever the details, what mattered most was this. He had made an oath upon that sword, and then he broke it. And in response, so did the blade. The act was quiet, no crowd, no executioner. Just the nobleman, locked in a cell, holding the sword that once rested at his hip in ceremony, in council, in battle. He took it by the hilt, raised it one final time, and drove it into the stone floor. Not to escape, not to kill, to end it. The tip cracked off like judgment. That broken sword was never repaired. Instead, it was left exactly as it fell, tip shattered, edge dulled, dignity dissolved. When the nobleman was later led to his sentence, the blade remained in his cell, untouched. The guards called it la lama spezzata, the broken blade. But soon, the phrase took on another meaning. La lama spezzata began to appear in other places. Graffiti on stone walls, whispers among soldiers, even lines in bitter folk songs. It came to mean not just a sword, but a soul dishonored, a vow betrayed, the moment when loyalty ends and shame begins. Because in the chivalric culture of Italy's noble courts, a sword was more than metal. It was a symbol of allegiance, of rank, of one's word. To break a sword was to renounce not just war, but worth. And in this case, the sword was not broken by betrayal. It was broken because of it. Over the years, the blade became infamous. It was never melted down, never reforged. Some say it was encased in stone and built into the very wall of the prison as a warning to others. Others claim it was passed from warden to warden, shown to new prisoners who had once worn crests on their chest but now wore chains on their ankles. What we do know is that its image persisted. In the late 15th century, sketches of the sword appeared in a Florentine legal manuscript, depicting a blade missing its tip, labeled with only two words, giuramento spezzato, broken oath. No battle had taken it. No rival had bested it. It had been broken deliberately in despair, and perhaps that's why it lingered so powerfully in local memory. Because most weapons are lost in war. This one was lost in shame. It speaks to something eternal, that when a person breaks their word, the most sacred tools in their hands become hollow. That honor is not just worn or claimed, it is held, upheld. And if it's dropped, there is no sword sharp enough to restore it. But there is something else in this story too, something quietly human. Because the man who shattered the blade did so not to hide, but to confess. To admit, in metal and silence, what words could never say. That he had failed. That the oath he took once felt weightless, until it was gone. And in breaking the sword, he left a message. One not written in ink or signed with seal, but forged in steel, snapped on stone. Do not swear lightly. Do not lift a blade unless you mean to honor it. And if you do betray, let the silence speak louder than your defense. That broken tip, resting somewhere beneath centuries of dust, remains a reminder. That a blade raised in glory may be forgotten, but a blade broken by shame will never be. The blade that reflected your face as a skeleton. In the cold light of dawn, as shadows crept across the flagstones of the prison courtyard, there was one ritual older than the walls themselves, a blade. Not just any blade, a sword of shimmering steel, rumored to have been forged by a mad monk or a grieving blacksmith. Its edge was flawless, its weight, unremarkable. But what truly set it apart was its reflection. For if you looked into the sword's surface, you would not see your face. You would see your own skull, empty sockets, grinning teeth, the precise bone structure beneath your skin, as if the sword peeled back the last defense of the living and laid bare the truth of what you would become. It was called the bone mirror by some. Others named it the ferryman's blade. Whatever the name, its legend grew in the cells of condemned men. When a sentence of death was passed, the sword was carried from cell to cell by silent, hooded monks. Prisoners waited, dreading and longing in equal measure, for this was no mere token, no show of force. It was the last rite for those about to cross the border between worlds. The sword was presented with reverence. One by one, each man would hold it to his face, gaze into the polished steel, and meet his own death. Not as an abstraction, but as an intimate companion. Some men wept, falling to their knees. Some tried to turn away, only to be drawn back, compelled by a fascination that was almost holy. For in the reflection, the details were unmistakable. The curve of the jaw, the broken teeth from old fights, the long-forgotten childhood scar now etched in bone. Even the condemned who scoffed at priests and spat at fate could not mock what they saw in the sword. It forced a reckoning. Some used it for confession, whispering secrets to the blade, as if by speaking them they might lessen their burden before the end. Some clung to it, knuckles white, praying to faces no longer their own. Others handed it on with a kind of relief, passing not a weapon, but a mirror of truth. And always the monks watched, silent, unmoving, their own faces hidden, their voices never raised. They alone knew the sword's origins. They alone saw the change it wrought in the condemned. There are accounts from the fortress archives, records written in shaking hands by jailers and priests. One priest wrote, "I have seen the proudest murderers humbled, the most savage men rendered gentle, when their own death smiled back at them from the steel." Another described how one condemned man, after seeing his skeletal face, spent his last hours comforting others, saying, "We are all the same beneath the flesh." For centuries the blade was passed down, cell to cell, night after night. It was not used for executions. Its edge never tasted blood. Its purpose was not death, but acceptance. When the end came, it was said, those who had seen the truth in the sword walked more calmly to the gallows, as if they were led by a companion, not a captor. There are, of course, skeptics. Some claim it was merely a trick, a clever use of metal, candlelight, and fear, that the mind, prepared for death, filled the reflection with its own terror. Others suggest the blade was coated with mercury, distorting the image. But among those who held it, among those who whispered prayers to its silent gleam, none doubted what they saw. With the fall of the fortress and the dissolution of its brotherhood, the blade vanished. Some say it was thrown into a river, never to reflect again. Others claim it was stolen, now hidden in the vault of a collector who never dares look upon it. But the legend persists. For in the end, The blade offered no threat, only a promise, that all men, king or pauper, saint or sinner, will one day see their true face, not in fear, but in inevitability. And in the silence after, as the monks carried the sword away, only one thing remained, the echo of bones, grinning, waiting, reminding the living of the fate that comes for all. The sword that was hung outside the cell but never taken inside. Every night it swung in the dark, not inside the cell, but just beyond reach. A sword, plain, undecorated, its hilt worn smooth by the hands of guards long dead. In a corridor of cold stone and iron, in a prison somewhere in the heart of France, the sword waited. And for centuries, it never crossed the threshold. No one could say for certain why it began. Some say it was a ritual, an old superstition that each prisoner's fate hung by a thread, and that the sword was the thread made real. Others believed it was a warning, freedom, violence, hope, so close, yet eternally withheld. Whatever its origin, it became a constant. Each cell had its own. Sometimes one sword passed from door to door. Sometimes a rack of identical blades hung in the corridor, glinting in the torchlight. When the guards made their rounds, they would pause, unhook the sword, hang it by the next cell's door, and move on. The clink of steel on stone became a part of every night, a sound prisoners grew to hate, then expect, then, in some strange way, to need. Inside, the prisoners watched it. Some glared, others ignored it. But most, over days, weeks, months, began to fixate. The sword became a presence, a listener. And so, the letters began. Desperate for someone, anyone, to hear, prisoners wrote to the sword. Some scratched pleas into the stone with bits of bone or nail. Some whispered secrets at midnight, trusting that somehow the blade would remember what they said. Some composed entire confessions and prayers on scraps of cloth or smuggled parchment, addressed not to God nor family, but to the sword itself. In the prison archives that survive, you'll find fragments. To the sword that waits outside my cell. If I am freed, will you come with me? Sword, do you ever wish to be drawn? Tonight the wind howls. I think you are lonely too. In time, the sword became a kind of pen pal, a symbol of fate both cruel and indifferent. It was a thing of violence, yet it never struck. It was a promise of power, forever out of reach. For some, it was a god. For others, a judge. For the truly broken, it was a friend. One record tells of a prisoner who claimed the sword spoke back, tapping against the stone at night when all was quiet. Another recounted a man who died clutching a letter to the blade, never opened, never answered. But perhaps the most haunting part is this. The sword became a mirror. It showed prisoners the shape of their own longing, their need for hope, for release, for violence, for forgiveness. And yet, year after year, generation after generation, it stayed where it was, hung outside, never taken in. Eventually, the prison was emptied, the swords gathered up, their purpose done. Some melted, some sold, a few preserved in dusty museum collections. Yet, among the yellowed pages of prison records, you can still find the letters, testaments to longing, madness, and the unbearable closeness of hope. Today, if you visit the ruins, the cells are empty, the stones cold, but imagine it, the glint of steel in the hallway, just beyond reach, the words of the forgotten echoing in the dark, sword, if you truly listen, remember me. The weapon that no soldier would claim. It was a sword nobody wanted. Not because it was blunt or broken, not because it was old or ugly, but because it was cursed, or so they said. The blade's story began in shame. In the mud of a battlefield, beneath the shadow of banners and the roar of war, one soldier made a choice no army forgives. He ran, a deserter, vanishing into smoke and blood, leaving his brothers behind. But before he fled, he forged a weapon. Some say it was made in secret, hammered together by stolen fire and desperate hands. Others claim it was the blade of his old commander, seized in panic as the battle lines broke. What mattered was this. It was his, and only his. And as he ran, the sword ran red. Nobody saw what happened on that night, who he fought, who he killed. But when the deserter was finally caught, the blade was still slick with blood. Enemy? Ally? It was never clear. All that was certain was that the steel now carried more than stains. It carried suspicion. In any army, a deserter's fate is sealed. But this one died with a weapon in his grip and a curse on his name. The officers refused to touch it. The smiths would not reforge it. No soldier wanted the sword. It was considered unclean, tainted by fear, by betrayal, by the weight of lives taken outside the code of battle. And so it was sent away, not to the armory, but to the prisons. There, in cold stone corridors and candlelit cells, the weapon found new hands, not warriors, but traitors, rebels, men condemned not for losing, but for switching sides. The sword was passed from cell to cell, sometimes smuggled under straw, sometimes hidden in the cracks of a wall. It became a tool, not for battle, but for barter. A symbol, not of glory, but of disgrace. Some prisoners used it to carve their names in wood. Others hid it, fearing the bad luck it was said to bring. And some, desperate and angry, pressed it to the bars, imagining vengeance that would never come. The guards whispered too. They claimed that anyone who kept the sword fell ill, or lost their trial, or died before dawn. Some called it the traitor's blade, others the coward's curse. Yet the weapon survived. It never returned to open battle. No knight would wear it, no captain would claim it. If it appeared in a cell, men went silent. They made the sign against evil. They spat on the floor, because they all knew the sword was marked, not just by blood, but by memory, by fear, by the breaking of oaths. Years passed, and the sword's legend grew. It was rumored to have changed hands 100 times, each owner worse off than the last. Prisoners would pass it quickly, hoping to shed its luck. Some tried to throw it in the moat. Somehow, it always returned. Found in a corner, buried in straw, wedged behind a loose stone. Eventually, the war ended, the prison emptied, the blade was left behind, half buried in the dust, its edge dulled, but its curse alive. When the old fortress was finally torn down, workers found the sword and brought it to the local magistrate. He refused to take it. The blacksmith who examined it refused to melt it down. Even thieves wanted nothing to do with it. Today it rests in a forgotten drawer in a minor museum, tagged but never displayed. The inscription on the tag reads simply, "Unclaimed sword circa 15th century, found in prison ruins." But if you ask the locals, they'll tell you its real name, the weapon that no soldier would claim, the blade that ran from battle and never returned. A weapon that reminds us, sometimes, it's not just blood that stains a sword. Sometimes, it's the story. And some stories are too heavy for any hand to bear. The sword that recorded its own story. In a quiet vault beneath the old city of Prague, behind iron gates and crumbling limestone, lies a blade unlike any other. It is not famous for bloodshed nor legend, nor the hand that forged it. It is famous because it tells its own story. Etched into its surface, handle to tip, are hundreds of strange, winding characters. Not in Latin, not in Czech, not in German. The script remains undeciphered. But it stretches across the blade in delicate, haunting strokes, growing more crowded with every century. This was no royal sword. It belonged to a prison, and the ones who carved it were the condemned. The first markings date back to the early 1600s, scrawled by prisoners held in Prague's dark jails, rebels, thieves, dissidents, heretics. In time, each of them, it seems, was allowed, perhaps even invited, to leave something behind, but not on paper, not in ink, on the sword. The blade was old even then, a ceremonial weapon kept in the warden's office, once used to signal death sentences, later reduced to a relic. But the prisoners saw more. They began to carve verses, shapes, symbols, using nails, bits of bone, broken glass, not randomly, not graffiti, but with reverence. They weren't defacing the sword. They were writing into it. Some of the early lines seemed to resemble prayer. Others looked like verses, metaphor and rhythm without any known tongue. And as years passed, the blade became more than metal. It became memory. In the 18th century, when Prague's prisons filled with political enemies and starving peasants, the carvings intensified, layer upon layer, like sediment. Some lines trace over others, bending to avoid older phrases, never erasing, only adding. It became a living script, and what's more haunting is that it didn't stop. The last confirmed inscription was made in 1810, long after the sword was removed from active use, long after the prisons had changed hands. Someone, no one knows who, added 6 fresh characters to the spine of the blade. The markings matched the older script nearly perfectly, but no witness was ever recorded. By then, the sword had become an artifact. It was placed behind glass in a small city archive, a curiosity, a relic of forgotten punishments. But even under lock and key, someone had returned. Someone had continued the story, and no one knows how. For over 2 centuries, linguists and historians have tried to decode the script. Dozens of theories have surfaced. Some claim it's a cipher, designed to disguise dangerous ideas. Others suggest it's a constructed language, born inside prison walls, passed from inmate to inmate like a torch in the dark. And then there are those who believe it was never meant to be understood by outsiders, because the sword didn't speak to the world. It spoke to those about to leave it. Prague's archives now refer to the blade as the sentence blade, though it was never used to kill. Instead, it carried a different sentence, one carved in steel from the hands of the forgotten. 1,000 final whispers layered into one long, eternal murmur. What makes the blade so unique is that it breaks every rule. Weapons are meant to be silent. Prisoners are meant to be erased. And yet here, in this cold length of iron, they recorded a defiance that time itself could not silence. They turned a tool of judgment into a voice, not a scream, but a song, untranslated, undimmed. Even now, the blade rests in a climate-controlled case under dim lighting. Visitors pass it in seconds. Few notice the carvings. Fewer still ask what they mean. But those who pause, those who look closely, swear they can feel it. The weight, the sorrow, the urgency of hands that had nothing left but a final line to leave behind. And the eerie question lingers. Who carved the last one? Because no guards reported it. No scholar was present. The archive was locked. But the sword changed anyway, as if, after centuries of speaking for others, it had begun to write for itself. The hilt of bones passed as a test of regret. There are legends that cling to stone like lichen, refusing to die. Some stories are born from cruelty so sharp, so perfectly measured, that they carve themselves into the memory of a place forever. Deep beneath the crumbling ruins of a fortress, its exact name long lost to centuries of whispered fear, there stood a prison so grim that its own walls seemed to sweat with regret. In this shadowed underworld, hope was rationed in thinner scraps than bread. But there was one ritual that set this prison apart from all others, a trial that blurred the line between mercy and madness. It was called the passing of the hilt. To understand the power of this ceremony, you must first know the weapon at its center. Unlike the cruel axes and whips that hung from hooks on the walls, this blade was not a tool of violence, but of judgment. Its hilt, crafted not of wood or iron, but of bones, human bones, worn smooth by the trembling hands of generations. No one remembered whose bones had been chosen to form the grip. Some whispered they belonged to the first warden, others to the earliest martyrs of the dungeon, men who had gone to their deaths cursing the world for its injustice. What is certain is that over decades, maybe centuries, the handle gathered not only the sweat and blood of the desperate, but the unspoken weight of sorrow itself. The weapon itself was never drawn during the ritual. It was the hilt, cold and unnerving, that mattered. Its surface was etched with ancient runes and the shallow grooves of fingernails pressed too hard in panic. The prison's oldest stories claimed the hilt remembered each person who held it, that every tear absorbed by the porous bone fed some secret, silent mechanism of fate. New arrivals to the prison, whether rebels, thieves, soldiers, or the falsely accused, were ushered in darkness to the stone hall known only as the Gallery of Sighs. Here, beneath the flicker of torches, the hilt was laid upon a velvet cloth atop a plain wooden table. The guards, their faces blank as death masks, explained the rules in voices drained of hope. Each of you will take the hilt. You will hold it for as long as you can bear. If you feel nothing, pass it on. If you are moved to tears, let them fall. Only those who truly weep will be spared the torturer's hand. No one knew when the ritual began, or why. Some claimed it was a way for the cruelest wardens to amuse themselves, watching hard men break before ever meeting the whip. Others insisted it was a test handed down by priests, a last chance for lost souls to prove their humanity before darkness claimed them. Regardless, every inmate soon realized that this ritual was more than theater. It was a trial by regret, and it was deadly serious. The effect of the hilt was as strange as it was chilling. For many, it was simply a chunk of ancient bone, its surface oddly warm from the last grip. They would squeeze it, feign a shudder, and toss it down the line, their hearts steeled by pride or innocence. But not everyone could mask their reaction. Something in the hilt seemed to know when regret was real. It was said that those who carried secrets or had left wounds behind in the outside world could not hold it long. For some, a lifetime of unspoken guilt came roaring to the surface. The faces of children left hungry, friends betrayed, lovers abandoned, all flashing behind their eyes in terrible clarity. Those who broke down, racked with sobs or silent tears, would find the guards watching closely, exchanging unreadable glances. These were the ones who would be spared, at least spared the worst. For in that pit, true mercy was rare. To be chosen by the hilt meant that your soul had not been hardened beyond redemption. The torturers, as brutal as they were, seemed to believe that a man or woman who could still cry was not beyond hope. They would be sent to lesser punishments, bread and water instead of starvation, a beating instead of the rack, a month in chains instead of years. To weep was to prove your own humanity, to buy, at the price of dignity, a small chance at survival. But the price was steep. Those who could not cry, whether because of a hard life or simply a stubborn nature, faced a darker fate. It did not matter whether they were truly heartless or only outwardly strong. The hilt showed no mercy for the stoic. These men and women would be marked for the most savage torments the dungeon could devise. The logic, if there was any, was cruelly simple. Pain cannot break what sorrow has already shattered. And so, the legend of the hilt grew. Some believed it was cursed, able to draw out guilt from even the most remorseless. Others thought it was a trick, that the guards only spared those who wept because it was easier to control the broken. There were tales of hardened criminals who, after years of violence and cruelty, finally wept when their hands met the bone, only to be found dead in their cells the next morning, their faces peaceful, as if some final burden had been lifted. There were stories, too, of innocent men and women, unable to force tears, condemned as monsters and left to perish in agony. No one outside the prison ever witnessed the passing of the hilt. The ritual became a kind of living ghost, haunting the dreams of the survivors, whispered about in taverns and family kitchens for generations. Some said the hilt grew heavier with each soul it judged. Others insisted it was not the weight of the bone, but the weight of memory that bent the wrists of those who held it. In time, the prison itself fell into ruin. The walls cracked, the stones shifted, and rain washed away the bloodstains. But the hilt survived. When treasure hunters finally breached the gallery, they found the weapon resting atop a mound of shattered chains, its grip polished to a ghostly sheen. Some say the bones were warm to the touch, as if the sorrows of the past still lingered, waiting for a new hand to hold them. What does this story mean in the end? Is it a tale of mercy or cruelty? Was the hilt a tool of redemption, a final chance for the damned to grieve and be spared? Or was it simply another device of torture, a way to make the act of survival itself an ordeal? The answer, perhaps, is lost with the last person who held it. But even today, in certain corners of the world, the legend endures. In every place where regret walks hand in hand with punishment, the spirit of the hilt lives on. It is a reminder. Sometimes, the greatest pain is not in the body, but in the soul. And sometimes, the only thing that can save us from ourselves is the simple, shattering truth of our own tears. So the next time you hear a story of a criminal who broke down in sorrow, or a victim who found mercy in their weeping, remember the hilt of bones. Remember that beneath all the walls we build, beneath all the masks we wear, there is a truth so old and deep it cannot be hidden. A truth that, sometimes, only a single tear can reveal. The sword used to swear innocence, never violence. In a windswept corner of Ireland, where stone crosses guard the hills and ancient mists curl around the thatched roofs, there was once a blade more powerful than any army. Not for blood, not for battle, but for truth. This was the oath sword, known in half-whispered Gaelic as Claim na Firin, the sword of truth. For centuries it was laid in the hands of the accused, not to defend themselves, but to swear their innocence. In a land marked by clan feuds, shifting loyalties, and old grievances, violence was common. Justice, however, demanded something different. The blade itself was unremarkable. Modest, single-edged, its steel worn from generations of hands. The hilt was wrapped in faded leather, the pommel carved with spirals older than written memory. Yet what made it sacred was not the iron, but the oath it demanded. No one allowed it to be drawn. Not in rage, not in fear, not even in desperation. To unsheathe the oath sword was a violation, a desecration. Its edge had never tasted blood. Instead, it tasted vows. When trial day came, the villagers would gather in the roundhouse or beneath the shadow of the dolmen. The accused, trembling, would kneel as the elders brought forth the blade in its scabbard. The silence would thicken, broken only by the wind and the shifting of peat underfoot. Then, the ritual began. The sword was pressed into the hands of the accused, still sheathed. They would close their fingers around the worn leather, bow their head, and swear their innocence before kin, rival, and spirit alike. Some said you could feel the weight of every vow that had come before, a heaviness, ancient and unyielding. The moment the oath was spoken, the crowd would exhale as one. There was power here. For to break the vow sworn on the oath sword was to invite ruin, sickness, madness, exile. Legend said the blade remembered every liar, every coward, every oath breaker. Cattle would sicken, storms would flatten thatch, and family lines would dwindle to nothing. The sword became the village's conscience, an iron witness to the soul. Rarely, so rarely it was spoken of only in fireside fear, someone would try to draw the blade, to use it as a weapon, to threaten or attack in the passion of the moment. But the elders were always watching. Such acts were met with horror, sometimes even banishment. For to turn the sword of truth into an instrument of violence was to break the pact between people and the land itself. And so, the sword remained sheathed, year after year, trial after trial. Its silence was more terrifying than a battle cry. It forced men and women to face themselves in the eyes of their community. There was no steel as sharp as a conscience laid bare. Outsiders scoffed. Norman lords and English bailiffs called it superstition, a relic of barbarian days. Yet even they sometimes paused, uneasy, before the quiet force of the ritual. In the parish records and the annals of the old friaries, you'll find occasional references to the blade that spilled no blood, and to villages ruled by the oath, not the sword. As time wore on and the world grew louder, the oath sword faded from use. Laws came from far-off cities, and trials moved from the dolmen to the courthouse. Yet, in some valleys, the memory lingered. In the hush before a difficult truth, in the closing of hands around something invisible, people remembered the weight of the vow. They say the blade still exists, hidden in a chapel or beneath a cairn, its scabbard worn, its purpose unchanged, waiting for the day when truth is once again valued more than victory. Because in that wild place, beneath those gray skies, it was never violence that made a people strong. It was the courage to swear innocence, and mean it. The blade that would rust, instantly when raised. There was a legend in the prison, one blade, many hands. A sword, unremarkable at first glance. Steel hilt, dull glint, worn leather grip, passed down from prisoner to prisoner as the years ticked by. It was not supposed to exist. Weapons were forbidden. Yet, in every chronicle, the same story surfaced. The blade that would rust instantly when raised. It began, as legends do, with a desperate act. The first prisoner to receive the sword was said to have found it buried beneath loose stones in the cell, wrapped in oilcloth, untouched by time. He thought it a miracle, proof that fate had not forgotten him. But the moment he gripped it in anger, when he raised it to strike back at a guard or curse his luck, a patch of rust blossomed across the blade, spreading so quickly it seemed to flower before his eyes. The steel dulled, flecked orange and brown, almost crumbling beneath his fury. The blade was rendered useless, limp, and cold. When the anger passed, when the sword was set down and held in silence, it regained its sheen, slowly, as though exhaling. Each prisoner who held it tried their own experiment. Some tried to use it for escape, others for vengeance. Each time, the result was the same, rage-bred rust, calm restored shine. It was a paradox made real, violence made impotent by its own emotion. The sword passed through many hands. Some prisoners tried to trick it, holding it in pretend calm, masking their rage. The rust always knew. In those moments, the blade grew even darker, spots appearing at the mere thought of violence. But in moments of reflection, confession, forgiveness, when the blade was cradled as a memory, not a weapon, it would gleam. It was as if the sword desired peace, refusing to serve wrath. The prison guards grew wary of the legend. Some dismissed it as madness, a trick of light, or a prisoner's fantasy born from too many years in the dark. Yet, when they confiscated the blade, it rusted so quickly in their hands that they cast it back into the cell, whispering prayers as they did. Letters from prisoners remain, scribbled on scraps of linen and smuggled to the outside world. I raised the blade, thinking it would free me. It showed me only my own rust. And another? Tonight I held the sword and wept. It shone so brightly in the candlelight, I could almost see my home. Over decades, the sword became a symbol, not of violence, but of restraint. The prisoners began to treat it as a relic, passing it only to those who had given up hope of revenge. It was used to swear oaths of peace, to settle disputes, even to bless the dying. When the prison finally closed, the blade was nowhere to be found. Some say it was taken by the last warden, who tried to draw it in secret and watched it corrode in his grasp. Others believe it remains, hidden in the ruins, waiting for another hand to test its temper. But the legend endures, that somewhere there is a sword that cannot be raised in anger, a blade that rusts at the touch of wrath, but shines with the weight of forgiveness. And perhaps that is the lesson, that the greatest weapon in a place built on violence is not the edge of steel, but the courage to hold it and never strike. The sword that faced the wall for 300 years. It never saw the light of battle. For 3 centuries, a sword hung nailed to a stone wall in the deepest cell of a monastery prison. Blade turned inward, toward the damp, cracked mortar. Its hilt, worn smooth by generations of trembling hands, protruded into the cold and echoing gloom. No one remembers who drove the first nail, or why. Some say it was penance for a crime, others a test of faith. All that is certain is this. In that small cell, the sword was never meant for violence. It was meant for memory, for confession. Each new prisoner, brought down spiral stairs and through heavy wooden doors, was shown the sword at dusk. They were told the same thing. Here, all must speak, not to us, to the blade. Tell it what you have done. Leave nothing out. Some knelt. Some wept. Some laughed bitterly, mocking the ritual. But all of them, in the end, spoke. They confessed their sins, real and imagined. Stolen bread, broken vows, betrayals whispered in candlelit halls. Sometimes, the walls seemed to hold their words, as if the stone itself grew heavier with every secret. When the confession was finished, the prisoner would reach out, touch the hilt, feeling the chill of iron, and then, with slow reverence or reluctant duty, pry the sword from its nail, not to wield, but to pass. The ritual was unchanging. The sword faced the wall. It was handed hilt first to the next prisoner brought down to the cell. Each man, each woman, inherited the confessions of all those who came before. They too were told to face the blade, to tell the truth, to pass it on. 300 years. Through plagues and wars, through the rise and fall of kings, the sword never left the wall. Its blade, once polished and sharp, dulled with time, with rust, with breath. Monks recorded the ritual in their ledgers, an unbroken line of names, dates, and passing hands. Some years, the cell was empty. Other years, it overflowed. But the sword remained, always listening. Legends grew around it. Some whispered that the blade could judge the sincerity of a confession, that those who lied to it would fall ill, or dream of iron chains, or find their tongues twisted for days. One monk wrote that, after a particularly harsh winter, the sword grew too heavy to lift. Only after a night of unbroken prayer did it feel light again. No one dared to remove it. No one tried to use it as a weapon. It was a relic now, more sacred than any relic enshrined above ground. Its purpose was not to spill blood, but to hold it, to bear the burden of 1,000 secrets, 1,000 regrets. When the monastery was finally dissolved, centuries after the sword's first confession, the prison was emptied. The cell doors flung wide, sunlight finally piercing the gloom. The sword was pried from the wall, leaving a deep scar in the stone where the nail had been driven, again and again. It was brought into the daylight for the first time in living memory. The monks, old, frail, their order disbanded, debated what to do. Some wanted to bury it. Others argued it should be melted down, made into a bell or a chalice. In the end, they left it in a small chapel, hung above the altar. Blade still turned inward, never outward. It became a relic of remembrance, not of violence, a symbol of truth spoken in darkness, of the hope that confession could lift the weight of the world, if only for a moment. And though the cell has crumbled and the walls are gone, the sword's legend endures. A blade that never killed, a blade that never fought, a blade that faced the wall for 300 years and heard everything. Sometimes, the sharpest edge is not in steel, but in the silence that follows a secret. The weapon that lost its edge to time, but not its weight. In a locked chamber beneath a crumbling fortress prison, a sword rested in dust and silence. Its edge was gone, dulled by centuries, worn smooth by time, not fit for war, not sharp enough to cut. But those who held it all said the same thing. It was heavy. Too heavy. Not in steel, but in something else. Something no forge could shape and no whetstone could grind away. It was as if the sword had absorbed the weight of memory, and those who dared to lift it felt all of it. The sword's origin is uncertain. Some say it was once an executioner's blade, used not in battlefields but in prison courtyards where condemned men knelt beneath gray skies. Others believe it was ceremonial, raised in sentencing, passed from judge to jailer like a silent seal of fate. But over the years, its purpose blurred. By the time it was catalogued in the records of a 17th century Italian prison, it was already seen as a relic. Dull, unused, and yet untouched. No one dared discard it. No one questioned why it still occupied its place on the wall. Because the stories had started. Guards spoke of an unnatural weight when cleaning it. Prisoners, when forced to carry it as punishment, claimed their arms ached long after it was gone. Some said the sword could make your heart race. Others said it made the world quieter, as if absorbing sound. None of them had ever seen it used, and yet it felt used up, worn, not by contact, but by consequence. Over time, a myth grew around it, that every life the sword had witnessed, not necessarily ended, but seen perish, had left something behind, a residue, a sorrow, a kind of pressure that clung to the blade like fog on metal, not visible, but undeniable. And when it was weighed, on scales with precision, it was found to be slightly heavier than other swords of the same type and size. Not much, a fraction, but the difference was real. Scholars and skeptics offered explanations. Atmospheric corrosion, metal fatigue, composition anomalies, but the prison staff didn't care for the science. They called it la spada pesa, the heavy sword. And when they spoke of it, they did so with the reverence one gives a grave, because to them, it was not just steel, it was memory made solid. The sword remained on display for generations, mounted above the prison's central corridor. Every inmate passed beneath it. Some spat, others bowed. A few muttered prayers. It was said that a man awaiting execution could ask to touch it, and many did. Not to plead, not to resist, but simply to feel what came before, to feel what they were becoming part of. And yet, the sword never changed, its edge never returned, its weight never faded. It outlasted the jailers, the walls, even the purpose of the prison itself. When the site was decommissioned in the 1800s, the sword was transferred, still in its iron bracket, still untouched, to a state archive. Today it sits in a glass case. Most walk past it without a second glance. Another old weapon in a room full of sharper, shinier things. But those who know still speak of its weight. They say if you look closely, the blade seems to sag, ever so slightly, as if burdened. Not with rust, but with the imprint of silence. The kind of silence only found at the end of a life. The kind that never quite leaves. It's just a sword. And yet, it is not. It is every name whispered before the drop of a blade. Every breath held between sentence and execution. Every pair of eyes that locked on steel in their final moment. The weapon did not kill them, but it saw them, and in that seeing, it changed. Because not all blades are judged by how they cut. Some are judged by what they carry, and this one carries more than weight, it carries time. The blade that was meant for one battle that never came. There are relics in this world whose purpose was decided before they ever tasted air. Blades hammered into existence, not just as weapons, but as promises. Some are broken in battle, and some become the stuff of legend, but a rare few are neither, left to gather dust in the twilight space between dream and disappointment. In the depths of a long-forgotten fortress, built on windswept cliffs where the fog rarely lifts, there is one such relic, a sword forged for a single decisive battle that never arrived. This is its story, the blade that waited for a war that never was. The fortress itself was already old when the idea of rebellion began to stir. Its walls were thick, pitted by storms and older sieges, with moss crawling up between the stones. Beneath its high, narrow windows, a small garrison kept uneasy peace in the name of a distant king. But unrest smoldered in the valleys below. For years, whispers moved from farmstead to farmstead, carried in the smoke of secret fires and the shifting eyes of villagers. Taxes had risen, the harvests had failed, and the justice meted out by the local lord grew crueler with each passing year. The land hungered for change, and the people for a champion. And so, in the heart of a winter night, under lanterns shuttered tight, a plan was hatched. The fortress's own blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Eric, was enlisted to forge a blade unlike any other. It was to be the rallying standard for the rebellion, a symbol, not just of steel and blood, but of hope. Eric worked in silence, trusting only the darkness and his own resolve. He shaped the sword with painstaking care, folding the metal again and again until it caught the light with an otherworldly gleam. He inscribed it with a single word, Libertas, hidden in the fuller, visible only to those who looked for it. The blade was meant for the rebel leader, a man whose name would never be remembered outside the jailer's ledger. He was a farmer's son, strong of arm and gentle of voice, chosen not for his experience in war, but for the trust he inspired in others. He would carry the sword into the first and final battle, raise it high, and in doing so, call forth a tide of courage that might sweep the tyrant from his throne. But history has a taste for irony. The plan was betrayed. Some say for gold, others for the desperate promise of mercy. Before a single rebel could gather at the fortress gates, the king's men fell upon the ringleaders. The blacksmith was thrown in chains. The farmer's son was seized in his bed, dragged through the mud and into the fortress's cold heart. The sword, still gleaming with oil, untested, was confiscated, never tasting blood nor ringing in the air above a charging crowd. For most weapons, this would have been the end, a quick melting down, a forgotten inscription vanishing in the forge. But something about this blade troubled the jailers. It was too fine to waste, too heavy with meaning to be repurposed for an ordinary soldier. The warden, a superstitious man, refused to hang it on the wall or keep it in his private armory. Instead, he ordered it locked away in the prison wing, among the cells of the doomed conspirators. It was here that the blade began a second life. The first to hold it was its intended bearer, the would-be rebel leader. For weeks he stared at it from behind the bars, sometimes reaching through to touch the hilt, sometimes whispering to it in the dead of night. To him, it was not a failure, but a reminder. The cause was not dead, only sleeping. When his time came to be taken to the gallows, he left the sword behind, asking that it be passed to another prisoner. The guards, bemused or perhaps moved by some trace of pity, allowed it. And so the sword became a silent companion for generations of inmates. Some gripped it in anger, others in longing. There were those who dreamed of escape, who pressed their faces to the bars and imagined the blade in their hand, leading a charge through the fortress gate. There were others, broken by years in darkness, who wept as they held it, mourning the future that slipped away before it could be born. Stories grew around the blade. Some said that on stormy nights, the metal would ring faintly, as if it remembered the clash it was forged for. Others claimed that those who held the sword felt a surge of courage, or a crushing wave of regret. It became a ritual for new prisoners to hold the blade for a night, to tell it their story, to pass on their hopes or bury their shame in its cold steel. There were attempts now and then to use the sword for violence. Once, during a prison riot, a desperate man tried to drive it through the bars, only for the blade to snap at the tip, as if it refused to draw blood in a battle that meant nothing. Another time, a guard tried to sell it to a passing merchant, but was found dead the next morning, the sword lying untouched beside him, his face frozen in terror. As decades became centuries, the fortress above decayed, the kings changed, the banners faded, and the reasons for rebellion grew vague and distant. But in the dungeon, the sword endured. No longer a weapon, it became an artifact, a vessel for dreams and disappointments, for courage unspent and hope deferred. Prisoners passed it from cell to cell like a relic, each marking the hilt with a notch or a name, each adding a new story to its legend. Eventually, even the prison was abandoned, the last warden left with the keys rusted and the gates gaping wide. Yet, when explorers and scavengers finally picked through the rubble, they found the blade resting in a cell, precisely where it had begun, unsheathed, untarnished, and heavy with the weight of all it had seen. What does it mean, this blade that never saw battle? In a world obsessed with victory and defeat, with heroes and villains, perhaps its story is the most honest of all. Not every rebellion is fought on open fields. Not every promise is fulfilled. Some dreams are betrayed before they ever take form, and some weapons are forged for battles that never arrive. Yet even in failure, there is meaning. A defiant hope that lingers in the memory of those who touched the hilt, who whispered to the steel, who believed that things might have been different. The sword that was meant for one battle that never came is, in the end, a mirror. It reflects the hopes of the forgotten, the courage of the defeated, the dreams of the damned. Its true power lies not in the blood it never shed, but in the stories it preserved, a silent witness to the truth that history is shaped not only by the wars that are fought, but by the battles that are lost before they begin. And so it waits still, somewhere in the ruins, a monument to longing and to the untold thousands who dream of freedom but never find the chance to claim it. Perhaps one day someone will find it and finally raise it high, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. Until then, the blade endures, and the legend of the war that never was remains, echoing through the stones like the sound of a distant army forever approaching, never arriving.